The German soldier heard them before he saw anything. Parachutes don't make much noise when they open, but hundreds of them create a sound like wind through fabric, a rustling whisper that carries across open fields on a quiet night. It was just past midnight on June 6, 1944, and the sky above Normandy was filled with something that sounded like an invasion. He raised the alarm. His unit scrambled into defensive positions. They fired into the darkness at shapes descending from above. The sounds of gunfire erupted across the field, not just from German positions, but from the paratroopers themselves. Muzzle flashes in the grass, the unmistakable crack of rifles. But when the soldiers moved forward to engage, they found nothing. No paratroopers, no return fire, just scattered debris, still burning pyrotechnics, and cloth shapes that looked almost human in the dark. Some were still making noise, recorded gunfire, playing from small devices, gunshots with no guns. The soldier realized he'd been shooting at scarecrows. This wasn't a mistake or a hallucination. It was Operation Titanic, one of the strangest deception missions of World War II, a plan to flood the French countryside with fake paratroopers in the hours before D-Day. The goal was simple but absurd: convince the Germans that a massive airborne invasion was happening in all the wrong places. The tools were even simpler. Burlap sacks filled with sand, shaped roughly like human bodies, equipped with explosive charges designed to destroy the dummy on impact and create the sound of battle. They were called paradummies, and on the night of June 5, 1944, over 500 of them were dropped across Normandy. Mixed among them were a handful of real soldiers, special forces operatives sent to amplify the illusion and then disappear into the night. Most of the world has never heard of Operation Titanic. It wasn't a battle. It didn't involve cutting-edge technology or legendary heroes. It was a trick, a piece of theater played out in the dark with fireworks and fake soldiers, and it may have saved thousands of lives. The problem facing Allied planners in early 1944 was brutal and unavoidable. They were going to land tens of thousands of soldiers on heavily defended beaches, and those soldiers would be vulnerable the moment they stepped off the boats. The Germans held the high ground, the fortifications, and the advantage of knowing the invasion was coming, even if they didn't know exactly where. If German reinforcements reached the beaches quickly, the invasion could collapse into a massacre. The Allies needed to buy time, to create confusion, to make the Germans hesitate and spread their forces thin. Deception became as critical as firepower. Operation Bodyguard was the umbrella plan, a web of lies designed to make the Germans believe the invasion would happen somewhere else, at some other time, with forces that didn't exist. Fake armies were created in Britain. Double agents fed false intelligence to Berlin. Entire ghost divisions were conjured with inflatable tanks and radio chatter. But all of that was strategic deception, aimed at German high command. Operation Titanic was tactical, aimed at the soldiers on the ground, the ones who would actually respond to an airborne assault. The idea came from the British Special Operations Executive, specifically from a group tasked with finding cheap, scalable ways to create chaos. Real paratroopers were invaluable and limited in number. Dropping them in the wrong place just to confuse the enemy was a waste. But what if you could simulate a paratrooper drop without risking real soldiers? What if you could make the Germans think they were under attack in multiple locations at once, forcing them to split their attention and their forces? The paradummy was born out of that question. It wasn't sophisticated. It was a sack shaped vaguely like a person, equipped with a small explosive charge that would detonate on impact. The explosion would destroy most of the dummy, leaving little evidence and create a noise loud enough to sound like battle. Some versions included squibs that mimicked rifle fire. Others had materials designed to catch fire and burn, adding to the visual chaos. When dropped from a plane at night, especially in large numbers, they could create the illusion of a full-scale airborne landing. But paradummies alone wouldn't be enough. If the Germans investigated and found only burned cloth and sand, the illusion would collapse immediately. The deception needed real soldiers, enough to make the threat believable, but not so many that their loss would matter strategically. That mission went to the Special Air Service, the SAS, Britain's elite special forces unit. Small teams, usually between 2 and 6 men, would be dropped alongside the dummies. Their job was to create noise, play recordings of battle sounds, fire rifles to simulate combat, and then evade capture. They were equipped with basic weapons, a few explosives, and recorded sounds of gunfire and shouting that could be played on portable devices. Some carried gramophones modified for field use, playing discs of battle noise on repeat. The mission was almost certainly a one-way trip. They were being dropped miles behind enemy lines with minimal support and no backup. If they were captured, they would be interrogated, likely executed. If they evaded, they'd have to survive in occupied territory until the invasion pushed far enough inland to reach them. They knew all of this when they volunteered. The night of June 5th was overcast, visibility poor, the kind of weather that makes flying dangerous and navigation difficult. That was intentional. The Allies needed cloud cover to hide the scale of the invasion fleet crossing the channel. Or the paradummies were loaded onto transport planes in bundles, stacked like cargo. Each bundle contained a dozen or more dummies, rigged to deploy in sequence. The SAS teams boarded their own planes, checking their equipment in silence. There were 4 drop zones selected for Operation Titanic, all positioned away from the real airborne landings at Sainte-Mère-Église and the areas around the beaches. 2 zones were north of the actual landings, 2 to the south. The idea was to stretch German defenses, make them think the airborne assault was broader and more dispersed than it really was. Just after midnight, the planes crossed the French coast. The paradummies went out first, tumbling into the darkness, their small charges timed to detonate seconds after impact. From the ground, the explosions looked like muzzle flashes, the burning material like parachutes caught in trees. The SAS teams jumped minutes later, landing in field and hedgerows, immediately activating their sound equipment and moving to create the impression of a larger force. The German response was exactly what the planners hoped for. Units that should have been moving toward the real drop zones turned instead toward the dummy sites. Confusion spread through the local command structure. Reports came in of paratroopers landing in multiple locations, sometimes miles apart. The Germans didn't have enough forces to engage everywhere at once, so they hesitated, tried to confirm reports, requested reinforcements. Some units were pulled from positions near the actual invasion beaches and sent inland to deal with what they thought were Allied airborne units. In at least 2 locations, German soldiers fired thousands of rounds into empty fields, wasting ammunition on targets that didn't exist. The illusion held long enough to matter. Every hour the Germans spent chasing phantoms was an hour they weren't reinforcing the beaches. Every unit sent to investigate a paradummy drop was a unit unavailable for counterattack, but the operation wasn't perfect. Many of the paradummies failed to detonate properly. Some landed in trees or water, their charges misfiring or failing to ignite. German soldiers who reached the drop zones quickly realized something was wrong when they found intact dummies, crude cloth figures that didn't look anything like real paratroopers in daylight. In some areas, the deception collapsed within an hour. Local commanders recognized the trick and redirected their forces. The recorded battle sounds, although effective in the first moments, became obviously artificial when no actual combat followed, and the SAS teams, for all their training, were badly outnumbered and isolated. Some managed to evade capture, hiding in barns and ditches, relying on French resistance contacts to survive. Others were captured within hours. At least 1 team was caught before they could even activate their equipment. The Germans executed several captured SAS soldiers on the spot, treating them as saboteurs rather than prisoners of war. The effectiveness of Operation Titanic has been debated for decades. Some historians argue it was a critical piece of the D-Day deception, successfully drawing German forces away from the landing zones at a crucial moment. Others point out that the impact was limited and temporary, that the Germans would have been confused regardless, given the scale and complexity of the invasion. The truth is probably somewhere in between. The paradummies didn't win the war, but they contributed to the chaos that allowed the real landings to succeed. They bought time, created uncertainty, and forced the Germans to make decisions with incomplete information. The cost was minimal. The paradummies themselves were cheap to produce, essentially fireworks and sandbags. The SAS teams were volunteers who knew the risks. No major resources were diverted from other operations. For the price of a few hundred dummies and a handful of brave men, the Allies added another layer of confusion to an already overwhelming assault. What happened to the SAS soldiers is less clear. Some made it back to Allied lines after weeks of evasion, emerging from hiding as the invasion pushed inland. Others were captured and spent the rest of the war in prisoner-of-war camps. If they survived interrogation, a few were never accounted for, their fates unknown, likely killed in the field or executed as spies. The men who survived rarely spoke about the mission in detail. It wasn't the kind of operation that produced clear victories or heroic moments. They'd been dropped into the dark, made noise, and run away. Most of the credit for D-Day's success went to the soldiers who stormed the beaches or the paratroopers who took real objectives. The men who jumped with the paradummies were a footnote, remembered mostly by military historians and special forces communities. The paradummy concept didn't disappear after D-Day. Similar tactics were used in later operations, both in World War II and in conflicts that followed. The British used dummy paratroopers during the Rhine crossings in 1945. The Soviets experimented with similar deception techniques on the Eastern Front. Even in modern warfare, decoys and deception remain part of military strategy, though the technology has evolved far beyond burlap and fireworks. The basic principle holds: if you can make the enemy believe something that isn't true, you can change the outcome of a battle without firing a shot. Operation Titanic proved that deception doesn't need to be elaborate to be effective. It just needs to be believable long enough to matter. There's something almost absurd about the idea that scarecrows with explosives played a role in the largest amphibious invasion in history. It's the kind of plan that sounds too simple to work, too crude to take seriously. But war is often decided by details, by small advantages that compound into larger ones, by moments of confusion that delay a response or divide a force. The paradummies didn't need to fool the Germans for long. They just needed to create enough doubt, enough chaos to slow the reaction. In that, they succeeded. For a few hours, on the most important night of the war, the Germans were shooting at ghosts, chasing phantom armies through the French countryside, while the real invasion unfolded on the beaches. The legacy of Operation Titanic isn't found in monuments or textbooks. It's in the recognition that warfare is as much about perception as reality, that the enemy's beliefs can be as important as their capabilities. The Allies understood this in a way the Germans didn't, building an entire infrastructure of deception that surrounded the invasion. The paradummies were just one thread in that web, a cheap and dirty trick that worked because it played on fear and uncertainty. The German soldiers who fired into the darkness weren't cowards or fools. They were doing exactly what they were trained to do, responding to a threat that appeared real. The fact that the threat was fake didn't make their response irrational. It made the deception successful. Historians still argue about how many German units were diverted by Operation Titanic, how much time it bought, whether it made a measurable difference in the outcome of D-Day. The truth is, we'll never know for certain. War is too chaotic, too layered with overlapping actions and decisions, to isolate the impact of any single operation. But we know the paradummies were dropped. We know the Germans responded. We know some units were pulled away from the real landing zones, even if only for a short time. And we know that on D-Day, every minute mattered. The Allies needed every advantage they could get, every trick, every deception, every moment of confusion that might slow the German response. The paradummies gave them that at almost no cost. There's a deeper question buried in Operation Titanic, one that goes beyond tactics and outcomes. It's about the nature of deception in war, about the willingness to sacrifice truth for advantage, to use illusion as a weapon. The paradummies were harmless, just cloth and sand, but the idea behind them was ruthless. Make the enemy see things that aren't there, force them to waste resources on phantoms. Exploit their fear and uncertainty. It's the same logic that drives psychological warfare, disinformation, and propaganda. The difference is that on D-Day, it was used to save lives, to create an opening for an invasion meant to liberate Europe from fascism. The morality is clearer there than in most uses of deception, but the principle remains troubling. If you can convince someone that a lie is true, you can control their actions. The paradummies were a benign application of that power, but the power itself is anything but benign. Operation Titanic stands as a reminder that the most effective weapons aren't always the most powerful. Sometimes a scarecrow with a firecracker does more damage than a bomb. Sometimes the best strategy is to make the enemy fight shadows, while the real attack comes from another direction. And the men who planned it understood that. The SAS soldiers who jumped into the darkness understood that. And the German soldiers who fired at ghosts in the fields of Normandy learned it the hard way. The war was full of moments like this, small operations that barely register in the grand narrative, but that shape the outcome in ways we're still trying to measure. The paradummies didn't win D-Day, but they were part of the machinery that made victory possible. And for a plan that cost almost nothing and relied on the simplest of tricks, that's not a bad legacy.